Construction makers.
Thought we would check in on the bracket system, considering they just made some pretty big updates to it. So this one's going to be about the update to the game changers, and then also just sort of like where we feel like the bracket system is at. So let's start with the things that got taken off of the game changers list.
Yes.
There's not that many, but there was a couple.
So the first card is Trouble in Pairs, 2 and a white enchantment. If an opponent would begin an extra turn, that player skips that turn instead. Whenever an opponent attacks you with 2 or more creatures, draws their second card each turn, or casts their second spell each turn, you draw a card. And the second card is Trinisphere. It's 3 mana. It's an artifact. As long as Trinisphere is untapped, each spell that would cost less than 3 mana to cast costs 3 mana to cast instead.
In one of our previous videos, we talked about all the different game changers and what we thought about them being on the list. Trinisphere was one that we brought up as like, this doesn't really make a lot of sense because in a casual environment, it doesn't, like, making everything cost 3 isn't that really big of a deal.
I think we were iffy on Trouble in Pairs too, because Trouble in Pairs is kind of, I think we joked about how they wanted to get rid of extra turns, but Trouble in Pairs was a card that negated extra turns. So
well, and that falls in line too with our thoughts on sort of like answers being on the game changers list is a little weird because you're using up one of your game changer slots to do something that should protect you from other game changers. That always feels a little weird,
right?
Which they actually did a little nod to when they talked specifically about Force of Will,
right? Which was interesting
that they were talking about potentially removing it from the game changers list, which I think would be a great idea.
I don't know if I can confidently say like all the major counter spells in that way, but
Force of Will specifically.
Force of Will, I think I could see that going off the list.
Yeah. Anyway, jumping ahead. So as far as these coming off the list, seems fine.
Cards that have been added to the game changers list.
Right. So
there's a lot.
This is a pretty long list. I think there's like 18 of them or something. So let's go through and just read them off real quick, and then we'll probably just select a few to talk about, and then we can get to our bracket system thoughts generally.
Yeah, I'll just read the list out. Teferi's Protection, Humility, Narset, Parter of Veils, Intuition, Consecrated Sphinx, Necropotence, Orcish Bowmasters, Notion Thief, Deflecting Swat, Gamble, Worldly Tutor, Crop Rotation, Seedborn Muse, Natural Order, Food Chain, Aura Shards, Field of the Dead, and Mishra's Workshop.
So some of this is like shoring up some of what I think is logical consistency with the Game Changers list. Like we're bringing in the rest of the sort of tutors that cost 1 mana. Let's get those on the list because then at least we're consistent that all the tutors that cost 1 mana are on the list.
I think that was a big complaint that players had was why isn't Worldly Tutor on there? Why isn't Gamble on there? You know?
when the other ones were.
Right.
Also to put a few more green cards on the Game Changers list, there seemed to be a little bit of a bias there in terms of what the green was lacking.
Yeah.
And then also just some other like particularly powerful cards that just are kind of a no-duh to put on the list, like Necropotence. Humility is just like a miserable card to play against.
I definitely was surprised to not see Teferi's Protection on there initially.
Yeah. Well, okay, so I think Teferi's Protection being on the list is fine. It does fall a little bit into that category of like an answer,
right?
But it's probably more powerful than something like Force of Will or whatever would be, right? Force of Will,
I think it's
one thing.
Technically one of the strongest answers you could have.
Yeah, and it's particularly obnoxious when somebody just bloop, blinks out,
right?
And what you tried to do to them it doesn't happen. So
yeah, let's talk about a little bit of the philosophy of like why we think that some of these decisions were made, because they gave I think they were really great and thorough with giving a lot of reasons as to why some of these things were added, but there's definitely a certain pattern that we were kind of noticing about these cards that seemed a little strange as far as the decision making goes to add this to the Game Changers list. One in particular is Narset, Parter of Veils. So Narset, Parter of Veils, they actually grouped it with Orcish Bowmasters and Notion Thief. Narset says each opponent can't draw more than 1 card each turn. Basically, Orcish Bowmasters and Notion Thief have like similar sort of punishments to draw, or Notion Thief completely stops people from being able to draw.
So on the most extreme end, these cards are particularly powerful with spells that are called Wheels, which are named after the card Wheel of Fortune. You're discarding your hand, and then you're drawing back a bunch of cards. And these cards will lock out other players from being able to draw their cards back. So that is a problematic play pattern with these cards. So putting them on the Game Changers list sort of acknowledges that idea. But the problem that we're sort of talking about in the philosophy side of this is that these are cards that allow you to punish the dominant strategy of the format, which is what we call making butter. And in Commander context, we define sort of these things as butter being economy, being drawing cards, playing extra lands, things like that. And in Commander, 1-to-1 removal is particularly bad in that you're spending a card to take another one of your opponents down a card, but your other two opponents weren't affected at all, which means that you're effectively advantaging them by doing this.
Right. The reason that butter is so much stronger is because normally in traditional sort of a war game that you might play is that the more that you are conquering another land, you are actually taking their resources. But in Commander, that's not the case. The more that you are single targeting another opponent, you aren't gaining anything from doing that. So what ends up actually happening is the greatest strategy is to not engage directly with any one person and instead build up as many resources as possible to take all three out at the same time, which is what you see at the highest level of play.
Right. And without these sort of mechanisms for curbing some of that, these ideas of punishing people for drawing lots and lots of cards or playing lots of land or whatever, which is sort of like a taboo in casual Commander, is affecting people's cards or affecting people's lands especially. It's even explicitly stated in the bracket system that mass land destruction is not something you should be doing.
What's mass?
Right. Good question.
Two lands?
Maybe 3. I don't know.
Oh.
So that's a problem. But it's interesting because there's sort of this unintended consequence of, okay, yeah, this makes players feel bad or whatever and potentially shuts them out of the game. But the flip side is if you're not affecting any of these things from those players, the game becomes about, well, who can just build up resources faster than everybody else, almost in a solitaire way, and then eventually just play something that wins the game.
Right. And I think the reason I think this does somewhat of a disservice to, I think, the growth of players actually, not that they have to consider that, I suppose, but I think they should, is that I think a lot of players don't quite understand at an early stage that the reason someone got ahead is because of their card draw, right? The reason is because you did not pay the one every time that there is a Ristic Study trigger.
Right, but even then, just to get into Ristic Study real quick, it's not just about paying the one.
You have a whole video on it.
I'm a whole video about this. Even if you pay the one, you're still falling further behind.
Sure.
So whatever.
Right. Being able to recognize that the more card draw someone has, that's a lot of value that they are gaining that you are not gaining. And so being able to basically have something that says, I don't have to pay the one and get behind it anymore, and I end up having this sort of this Narset or Orcish Bowmasters or Notion Thief or whatever to sort of negate that incline until someone else has to single target and get themselves, in a way, sort of further behind in order to remove the thing that's preventing them from getting ahead, I think is actually good, and I think is creating good, interesting interactions.
And these cards, on the other hand, give you a way to move yourself further up in the game while also curbing other players. So you have to think about the amount of advantage that these cards give you while also stopping the advantage of your opponents, or at least curbing it.
Now, that being said, I can see the justification for if casual tables don't want to worry about that type of thing, they just want to play a lot of creatures and swing with creatures, that's fine. And if these just end up being a bracket 3 through 4 and 5 sort of a thing,
well, they're on the game changers list. So
yeah, so then I think that's fine. I think that's understandable. But I think where maybe I get hung up on it is like, why then is this seeming to be like a negative, right, of preventing other people from sort of building up butter as opposed to removing things, right? And so you end up seeing a card like Aura Shards, right? And Aura Shards seems to be that like quintessential, well, you can remove artifacts and enchantments.
It makes a lot of guns, and it's a gun, it's an engine, right? That similar to like braids or something, right? Where it's a continual interaction mechanism where you're looking at something like Ristic Study, which is a continual butter engine, and they're like, that's fine, but continual guns interaction, not okay.
And I think that really it's that we need stronger gun engines, basically,
sure,
in order to counteract all of these current butter engines that we've got going on.
Choo choo.
Right.
Right. So again, this is the weirdness of putting answers on the game changers list, is that if you you're having the engines on the list, which is Ristic Study and Consecrated Sphinx, are probably the best.
And Necropotence, no.
Yeah, Necropotence are really, particularly good.
Oh wait, Necropotence gets around this. Never mind. Put that.
Yeah, because you don't draw. Yeah. So you're putting these engines on the list, and then you're also putting the things to counter the engines on the list, which means that, again, it's the same problem with like Force of Will, right? Where you as a player are now devoting slots in your your game changer slots at bracket 3 to answers rather than things that just make butter. So what that effectively means is that these cards are not going to get played because you would much rather be playing the engines than playing the things that stop the engines. So I don't really understand putting these on the list, to be honest. I'm sure some people are going to disagree with that idea, but whatever. They played against Narset and it was miserable. Okay, sure, but
also, I guess Narset's especially silly to me because just attacker. It's not even if you don't play removal, that's understandable. You don't play removal. We just talked about how actually playing single target removal is bad. You'll probably have creatures, and you can swing them at Narset.
Right. Yeah, that one's weird.
I don't know.
Yeah. It feels like, again, we're policing answers instead of problems, but whatever.
All right, so now that we've had time, we're not going to get into every single card. We got a lot of thoughts on them, but I think that's our primary point that we wanted to make. But so now that a little bit of time has sort of gone by since the brackets have been established, how do we feel overall about the bracket system?
Well, it was nice to get a little bit more insight into how Wizards is seeing the brackets and how they think the brackets are going.
Yes. We could get into that.
There was a little bit of data given in terms of the sort of uptake of this system within the community.
I actually have it if you want me to read it.
Yeah, go ahead.
So some of the data that Wizards actually provided on how the players have been responding to the bracket system is in the official survey done for MagicCon Chicago, 87% of people who tried the bracket system said it was helpful in their games. I actually think that that's really strong, but again, it's kind of a biased community.
Go ahead.
So,
I'll talk about the potential
There's
issues.
a lot of criticisms with some data collection here, but and then it said MTGO, or Magic Online team over at Daybreak Games, said about half of all Commander games on Magic Online are using the bracket system. And then they said it's unofficial, but they also talked with Amy, who runs Spellbot. I don't know, is Spellbot
it was something that helps matchmake across Discords for Commander games.
It pairs Commander games across many major Discord servers. About 54% of all games on those servers use Commander brackets to pair people.
Okay. So these are numbers. We don't know exactly when they got these numbers, but I'm more curious to see what the trend over time is. Does this continue to uptick or does it trend down? The other issue with the Commander Con survey, MagicCon survey that they did. Okay, so this was not done in a double blind way, right? You're literally asking somebody, was this helpful? And they know that they're giving that feedback directly to the person that is working, that the people working on it are going to see. You're asking exactly the audience that would be it was helpful. There's also going to be extreme bias in terms of this is a system that just was introduced. And players are going to have recency bias in that way, where they're going to start attributing a game that went well to the bracket system, which doesn't mean it was the bracket system that did that. They could have played those games anyway without the bracket system, and they could have been great games, but then now they're attributing that to the bracket system because it's there.
I was going to say, I think we've seen this a lot with game testing. You can ask people these questions. It's obviously good to get some data from what people are saying. However, I think what's more important is actually seeing how people are responding. Are the conversations that they're having actually beneficial? Is it actually creating more of these consistent outcomes of games that they want to see, as opposed to players saying these outcomes?
And that's a lot harder of a thing to do, right? You can't just say, well, did you like it? Did it help your games? They could just be like, yeah, I think so. Okay.
Right. And we technically we don't know how they collected this data. They could have done that.
That one I was just a little suspect of, but whatever, we'll move on. I'm seeing the brackets as being designed more as a tool, right? And we can start to get a little bit into some sort of, I guess, Christopher Alexander philosophy, where a design, the best design is one that satisfies the forces that are put upon it. So something like a tea kettle, right? It needs to be able to hold water. It needs to be able to get hot. It needs to be able to be handled even when it's hot. So it needs a handle. It needs a way to alert somebody when the water's boiling, right? And so you end up with these are the exact forces put upon something to fulfill the criteria of what is needed by that tool.
And I think that it might be important to sort of create the separation here, that's more of talking about, like you said, the experience of a tool, not the experience of game design.
Right. There's a big difference there. This has been my criticism of people using Christopher Alexander philosophy for game design, is because games, I don't really see them as tools.
Right.
They're experiences, but this bracket system is a tool.
You're trying to create something that is more accessible, easier for people to pick up and understand what the actual function is. Whereas a game, a lot of the times, there's a bit more of a hurdle, and you're trying to almost I don't want to say like an imperfect sort of a thing, but you're creating a very specific experience, right? Not just trying to create an easy experience.
Yeah, exactly. And so here, the most important factor is understanding the forces that are being put upon this tool. Like, what do the players actually need? It does feel like the game changers list side of this, it has entered the sort of community vocabulary a bit. That I feel like has broken through. The brackets themselves, I'm a little less sure of. But this idea of, this is, I guess, what I'm suspect of, is that are players using the entirety of the bracket system, or are they just happy that there's now a list of cards that they can point to say, I knew that card was strong, now it's on a list, and objectively that means it's strong?
In my opinion, I think what the Commander really needs is it needs a better guidance or guidelines to be able to evaluate power and what is and isn't actually strong. Because right now there isn't necessarily anything to point towards. And even CEDH, I think, complicates that a lot, because CEDH has so many of these weird, obscure like play patterns and lines of play that I think it's even tough for people to see, like, okay, is that actually that strong because it's in a CEDH deck, or is it strong because of the combination of cards within that deck and how it responds?
And honestly, I think the biggest tipping point between casual and CEDH is that it's combat damage. I think generally speaking, players in casual think that winning through combat damage is fair, right? You're playing fair Magic, where when you start to move into CEDH, you basically almost never win with combat damage. It happens sometimes, but usually your goal is, I want to beat all of my opponents at once, and I don't care what their life total is because I'm just assembling an I win the game button.
If you win with combat damage, it's combat damage to everybody in one totality, right?
So I do wonder about the complexity of this system and if there's a way to streamline this, because the more simple this is, right, you need to understand the forces that the players want. Like, what are the players' wants? What are they actually looking for here? And then how do you satisfy just that? And I think that this is already ballooned to be something that's larger than
And I
that.
think it's tough because I think that it's another common sort of design. I don't know if a paradox is the right word, but you want to know what the players want, but the players don't know what they want, right? They say what they want, and really you kind of have to read between the lines a little bit. And
there was also a comment about the explicit versus the implicit rules of the bracket system. And Gavin Valentine tried to make it really clear that the implicit is what should be guiding these brackets. The implicit being the rules that are sort of implied. It's not defined through the mechanics or the systems. It's defined by the community and shouldn't substitute rule 0, but it should be a sort of guiding light for each of these brackets. And he pointed to the fact that in the initial announcements of the system, it was flipped in that the explicit rules guided a lot of people's opinions of the system. But I think what this is more indicative of is I would listen to the players on this, because to me, what I'm seeing is a community that picked up the explicit rules and went, we want more of this. Now, maybe we're a little biased because that's the side that we're on, but the stuff that I was seeing by and large was that players want to be able to just sit down and play the game. They don't want to have to try to navigate a complex, convoluted system where all kinds of different things mean different things to different people. There's a little wiggle room there in terms of like, okay, is this a game changer? Is this banned? Can I play this? Can I play that? Yeah, sure, whatever. But by and large, I think the goal should be as simply as possible to get players to be able to sit down and have meaningful games against each other where expectations are relatively known, right? And then you play the game.
The explicit rules are what's stated, but they said, well, don't play like that. Play like this. Like, players aren't going to go off of that because there's no specific structure to it, right? These are Magic players. Like, of course, they're going to be going off of the explicit rules. My concerns is that trying to have the focus be primarily on the implicit rules versus the explicit rules means that there's actually going to be even more division with Commander players than there were previously. But now, on top of that, it's trying to also say, well, this is also a power level system and also a fun meter, apparently. And that when you start getting to 4, there's less fun play patterns. And it's like, that doesn't make sense, right? Like, no one would design a game saying, like, at the higher level, it becomes less fun.
Yeah, I think there's also the question of governance philosophy. Is this curation, or is this a tool for players to decide what kind of experience they want to have? Right now, there's a little bit of both going on, and I do wonder how much of sort of the committee's input is swaying that idea. And maybe that's good. Maybe that's indicative of the player base at large. But for me, I'm sitting here thinking, okay, how do we make sure that people want to use this thing? And that's to keep it as simple as possible, right? Honestly, I can see a world where there's not really brackets anymore, but it's like you're playing no game changers, you're playing some amount of game changers, or you're playing any of the game changers. And that's just, you let the players then decide on any of the other implicit rules with like a rule 0 by saying like, oh, well, we're going to play no game changers and we're also going to play fun theme decks or whatever, right? You don't need this sort of exhibition bracket. Like, let players decide whether or not they want to do that.
Especially because the things that divide brackets 4 and 5 and 1 and 2 are primarily implicit rules, right?
Yeah.
I think that maybe there's like a slight explicit difference between 1 and 2, maybe.
It's just that theme thing, is that exhibition should be around some kind of theme.
Right. And it's like, I'm sure there's theme decks that are cracked and can win very quickly. So,
well, and that was another thing that Gavin Valentine brought up, is he was basically saying, hey, if you're following the explicit rules and only following the explicit rules, then you're being a bad actor. Okay, well, what if I don't understand the implicit rules? I don't understand that like someone else is going to feel like I stomped them when my intent was not to stomp them, and yet now I'm being singled out as being the bad actor in that situation. Again, assume ignorance before malice, right? This is the pub stomp problem, right? Is that you're basically saying, oh, I lost, therefore that person's a pub stomper. Like, oh, that person's not following the implicit rules that they may not understand, they're a bad actor, right? I'm like, well, okay, we're now creating a bad dynamic. My
personal belief of what the most important thing is for Commander players to have is better ability to evaluate power level. And I think a big reason for that is because when I go and look at any sort of Commander content, it is all over the place. There's so many people that think so many different cards are super strong and super powerful, even like really prominent content creators that have been playing this game for years and years and years are looking at certain cards, and it seems like there's this like inability to understand like, how is that strong? It's strong at your table, or it's strong in this bracket maybe, but like it's not actually that good or that strong of a card individually. And I think a big problem with that is because there hasn't been this sort of explicit guidepost for players to be able to point to and understand like, this is the dividing line between what makes something strong versus not strong.
Yeah. And I think the Game Changers list is doing a decent job.
I think the Game Changers list, at the very least, is a good system to facilitate that. Even if it hasn't been perfect yet, I think that that's fine. And I think it, as a half measure for banning, is also just a nice design tool for them to have. Yeah.
And it's explicitly stating these are powerful cards. And I do think that players yearn for that. They want they could have a feeling of like, well, I think this card is very strong. And then suddenly it's on the Game Changers list and they go, oh, I was right. Yeah, that card is strong, right? You have an explicit way that some third party has confirmed a feeling that you had.
For future of the bracket system, what are you hoping for?
I just want it to be more simple. I think it's way too complicated. I think that the implicit rules are kind of ridiculous, and you're putting a knowledge burden on players that probably will have a hard time interpreting what any of that means. Ideally, it would only be explicit rules in terms of like, I think the easiest way to do that is no game changers, some game changers, any game changers. That's the easiest thing to do.
I think I'm okay with them including small things like mass land destruction. I just don't like the vagueness of it, right? There needs to be very, very specific of what does that mean? What does it mean to not chain into infinite turns or infinite combos or whatever? And right now it's still too vague. If you enjoyed listening to us talk about the bracket system update, please feel free to give us a little like and a subscribe, maybe a comment down below. Also, if you want to keep talking about this, or you want to talk about games or whatever else, you can join our Discord. You can find a link to that in the description of the video down below.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.